Greetings, this is Greg. This video will be about the Messerschmitt Me 163. As with my video on the Focke-Wulf TA-152, there's a shortage of information on this plane, but I do think there's enough out there to fill in the blanks using what we have on the plane itself, plus our knowledge of propulsion systems and aerodynamics. Moving on, when I make these videos, sometimes it's hard to figure out where to start. Everything in aviation connects back to a previous airframe design, engine, or people in some way. In the case of the Me 163, I think it makes the most sense to go all the way back to 1919. At the end of World War I, just after, the Treaty of Versailles imposed serious limitations on German-powered aircraft development and production. This caused the Germans to focus very heavily on gliders. In fact, it was the Germans who finally broke the glider endurance record set by the Wright brothers in this craft. That record had stood for 10 years, which was an eternity at a time when aviation records usually lasted weeks or months at best. However, the Germans put in very solid efforts and moved glider flying forward at a pace not seen before. One of the designers of gliders was a man named Alexander Lippisch. He was an advocate, and you could say a fanatical advocate, of the tailless configuration. During the mid-20s, he designed a tailless glider called the Stork. Several versions were built. I don't have pictures of each one. And with each version, there were various improvements made, and at some point, he attached an 8-horsepower motor to the Stork 3, giving it a total weight of 551 pounds or 250 kilos. The plane flew at an average speed of 78 miles per hour or 126 kph on a round-trip flight in Germany from Wasserkup to Kreuzberg and back. That's an impressive speed for an 8-horsepower airplane, even today. However, a demonstration to German officials at Tempelhof, that was the airport in Berlin at the time, it failed to impress them. They felt that the tailless design offered no advantages. However, there were others there that were impressed, and the demonstration at Tempelhof led to Lippisch getting financial backing for a new design, which he called the Delta I. Called that because the wing design resembled the Greek letter delta. That's why today most aircraft with similar type wings are called delta wings. Now the Delta I had a 30 horsepower engine and flew at a speed of 90 miles per hour. This was in 1931. It's worth pointing out that Reimar and Walter Horton of Horton Flying Wing fame witnessed an early demonstration of this plane and became very interested in the tailless configuration, and that's a story for another time. The plane was again demonstrated at Tempelhof, and the demonstrations included aerobatics, including spins, but again, the German officials were unimpressed. When Lippisch asked for a certificate of airworthiness, the German officials refused. They provided a long list of objections and insisted that a tail be fitted to the airplane. Now, the next several years didn't really pan out for Lippisch. He had dealings with Focke-Wulf and Fieseler, but none really worked out. There were some crashes, and the German Air Ministry, through another government agency, it was all very complicated, but they passed a resolution forbidding further work on tailless aircraft, claiming that they had no practical value or potential. But then something interesting happened. Dr. Walter Georgi, who was the director of the German Institute for Sailplanes, stepped in. Apparently he was a pretty heavy hitter in aviation because he was able to force the withdrawal of the aforementioned resolution, the one that banned further development of tailless aircraft. And not only that, he raised support for the rebuilding of Lippisch's Delta IV, which had crashed. They renamed it the DFS-9 Delta IV-B. It had quite a few design changes from the previous Delta IV, and was fitted with a 75 horsepower engine in the tractor configuration. About this point, another doctor, Dr. Lorenz, this particular character was the assistant to the chief of the Air Ministry's research department, and he requested construction of a second Delta plane, but with a lengthened fuselage so it could fit a, quote, special power plant, unquote. Of course, this special power plant was a rocket engine. Everything involving rocket power was secret at the time, but it appears to me that the entire reason Dr. Georgi from the Institute of Sailplanes stepped in was because he knew that rocket planes were coming and saw the potential in this area for Lippisch's tailless designs. It appears to me, though, that Lippisch's design was thought of as a backup plan. Here's why I say that. The Air Ministry seemed to be backing Heinkel's rocket plane, at least at this time, which was the HE-176. Now, history gets a bit murky here, and it's very difficult to sort out. I think it would take a historian that speaks German to figure some of this stuff out. But it appears that Professor Heinkel blamed the Air Ministry for the failure of the HE-176 to reach its potential. Lippisch said it was due to technical problems, mainly a lack of performance. And that's possible looking at the design. And we're not getting into the HE-176 now, but maybe another time. Anyhow, I'm afraid it's impossible to learn the truth about all of the inner workings and political intrigue of German aviation in the late 1930s. But what I do know is that Lippisch had major problems with the Air Ministry as well, just as Heinkel did, until he joined forces with Messerschmitt, which is exactly what happened in January of 1939. Now, Lippisch and his team went to work at Messerschmitt on a rocket-powered interceptor based on Lippisch's most recent airframes. Now, this was given the designation of Me-163. This designation was chosen for a reason, and the reason is that there had been a reconnaissance plane built by Messerschmitt called the Bf-163. So that plane was really more of what we would call a liaison airplane in the US, but the thinking was that by sharing the same number, 163, if word of the plane got out, people would think it's just an updated version of the older plane and wouldn't pay any attention to it, thus helping preserve the secrecy of German rocket plane projects. And I think that reasoning was sound. Just think of all the confusion between Me-109 and Bf-109. So having a Bf-163 and an Me-163 probably worked in their favor here. Now, it's time to get into some specifics of the planes. The two main versions that will be the topic of most of our discussions here are the 163A and the 163B. The A model is shown here. These were early prototypes used for testing. The B model, seen here, was the production variant. It's a similar but different airplane, different airframe, different engine, and used different but equally dangerous fuels. The wings are pretty much the same on both models. Now, before we go any farther, we have to talk about the fuel used to power the 163's rocket motor. It's impossible to understand the 163 without understanding the danger of flying it, and it's impossible to understand that without understanding the dangers posed by the fuel. Both planes used a combination of stoffs. There are many types of stoffs. Here's a list. Now, the word stoff is German, and near as I can tell, doesn't seem to translate to English very well. But I think it means something like combination of materials or chemical stuff. I'm sure one of our German viewers will help clear that up. The 163A used Z-stoff and T-stoff. The 163 used C-stoff and T-stoff. What's important to note here is that they both use T-stoff. Now, due to secrecy during the war, pilots didn't know what the stoffs were, but of course we know today. T-stoff was 48% concentrated hydrogen peroxide combined with hydrocarbon compounds. C-stoff was 30% hydrazine hydrate solution and methyl alcohol. Now, I am not a chemist, and you don't need to be either, but what you do need to know is that when these two stoffs meet each other, the result is a powerful explosion. We'll get into that when we get into the rocket engine, which will probably be in the next part. The optimal ratio is about 3 parts of T-stoff to 1 part C-stoff. That matters because the plane needs to carry 3 times as much T-stoff, and you'll see, we'll talk about that later. Now, this stuff was a nightmare to work with. Both fluids were colorless, so you couldn't just tell them apart by looking at them. T-stoff could only be kept in aluminum containers. It would rapidly disintegrate steel or iron. You couldn't use a rubber container because anything organic would instantly catch fire if it came in contact with it. By the way, that includes the human body. Furthermore, you don't want an open container because if a bug flies into it, an explosion can result. So it corrodes normal metals, catches fire really easily, explodes with minimal provocation, and it eats human flesh. So this is really, really bad stuff to be carrying around in your airplane. Now, T-stoff could only be kept in glass, enamel-coated, or specially treated containers that could not be stored in aluminum, opposite of T-stoff. On one occasion, and thankfully only one occasion, a mechanic poured a few liters of T-stoff into a bucket that had some residue of T-stoff still in it. He was immediately killed by the explosion. Now, imagine the fun of trying to build a fuel system that carries T-stoff using only materials available in 1941. You can't use rubber fuel lines, which means you can't clamp them. You can't use rubber O-rings. The T-stoff system was plumbed with lines made from some artificial fiber called mycolam. I have no idea what that is. And I assume aluminum lines, and I would assume they would have used something similar to an AN fitting at the end of the aluminum line, although I don't have a source for that. I'm just kind of guessing based on how I would have done it. Now, sealing this system was always a problem, and they often leaked with disastrous results, as we will see. As you can imagine, there were all sorts of safety procedures regarding fuel storage, transportation, servicing. They used different colored containers, 2 different fuel trucks that never came near each other. One would come and put in one type, leave, and then the other would come. One upside here to the stoffs is that they were water soluble, so tanks and lines could be flushed out with water after a flight, so mechanics didn't have to be working on a ticking bomb. There was a special squadron of test pilots for the 163. Here's the name in German. It translates more or less to Test Commando 16. I'll be calling it TC-16. I'm not going to try that German name. Now, these pilots were involved in a lot of very special and expensive training. We'll be meeting, I think, 3 of them in this video. Because of the 163's incredible climb rate, altitude capability, and lack of pressurization, the pilots of the 163's would be subjected to much more rapid changes in pressure than those of any other airplane. In order to train for this, they were regularly put into an altitude chamber. It's described by a 163 pilot named Mano Ziegler, author of Rocket Fighter, one of the sources for this video, as being about half the size of a railway car, built like a bank vault, and with an interior similar to the crew room on a submarine. Now, the altitude chamber they were using was a unit captured from the Soviets, and apparently it had a large enough range of pressure and rate of change so that if it wasn't operated carefully, it could literally kill you. The chamber was run by a doctor who was responsible for the pilot's acclimation to high altitude. The doctor also put them on special diets because gases built up in the digestive tract could be painful or even harmful during rapid pressure drops. It's interesting that Mano Ziegler commented that prevented him from eating his favorite meal, which was pea soup with bacon in it, or maybe it was ham. I didn't even know that was a German thing, but apparently, at least for him, it was. Anyhow, one upside to all of this was that when on extended leave, the pilots were required to stay somewhere with an elevation in excess of 2,000 meters in order to remain acclimated to high altitudes. The reason that's an upside is this gave the pilots the ability, in the name of national security, to reserve nice places in ski lodges that would be normally unattainable to the rank-and-file pilots. Now, their flight training involved basically 3 types of flights, 4 if you count gunnery practice, but that doesn't come in until much later. We're still really dealing with the unarmed Me-163As. There were no 2-seater 163s that were operational, so the pilot's first flight in the plane was solo. All of these pilots had extensive prior glider experience, and they would start out in a 163A with no fuel in it, be towed aloft by a Messerschmitt Me F-110, and at some point the tow cable would be released, the 163A would glide down and land. This allowed the pilots to get used to the plane without the dangerous fuel on board. Now, landing the 163 was a critical operation. First of all, like any glider, you really only have one chance to get this right. If you overshoot or undershoot the field, you crash into trees, most likely. However, unlike most gliders, in the 163 this would often be fatal because its landing was 2, 3, even 4 times higher than a typical glider. So instead of crashing at 30 miles an hour, you're crashing at 100 or 120 miles an hour. And furthermore, after a powered flight, there was always residual fuel in the tanks and lines, always. So if the landing was too hard, the 163 could explode. If you made a poor landing, the 163 was prone to flipping onto its back. If that happened, sometimes it would explode, other times it would leak T-stoff onto the pilot, dissolving him. So landings were super critical, and a lot of practice was given in defueled airplanes. The second type of flight involved towing the airplane aloft, then starting the engine and flying around until it ran out of fuel. Then it would glide to a landing. This reduced the risks of a powered takeoff and allowed the pilot to get used to powered flight, although still with the significant risks upon landing. And then finally, they flew powered takeoffs, climbed to high altitudes, and then would glide back down. These takeoffs were very dangerous. The 163's engine was temperamental and prone to quitting at any time. One of the worst scenarios for a pilot of a single-engine airplane is an engine failure right after takeoff. You just don't have a lot of time or options in terms of places to set down. Not only did this happen a lot in the 163, it happened too low to bail out. Your chances of surviving in a crash landing with fuel on board were near zero. By the way, don't worry, we'll be getting into all the technical aspects of this airplane. But the human aspect of the 163 story is really important, so I'm covering that to an extent. Now, the commanding officer of TC-16 was a man named Wolfgang Spate, and I apologize in advance for messing up German names. Normally I try and watch another channel with a German speaker who's referenced the same names and copy their pronunciation. It wasn't an option in this case. Now, by all accounts, Wolfgang Spate was an excellent pilot and an outstanding commander. He survived the war and scored 99 air-to-air kills. He actually finished off the war in the 262, flying with Gallen and a lot of the other high-scoring aces at the very end of the war there. Now, Wolfgang Spate was a hardcore bachelor, and you know the type. We all have friends like this. He had no wife, no fiancé, or serious girlfriend, and the reason that matters is it posed sort of a problem for the men of TC-16 because apparently it was tradition for the commanding officer's wife or significant other to act as a hostess or party planner for the group. So when the CO's aide, who was an experienced 31-year-old pilot named Joshi Pose, that's spelled P-O-H-S with the 2 little dots above the O that you see in German a lot. Anyhow, he started seriously dating a local girl named Suzanne. The two were apparently inseparable, and the group was quite happy about this, and they did everything they could to foster this relationship. They felt that an engagement would be coming, and with it, they would get an ideal first lady for their squadron to help arrange extracurricular activities with the locals. Now, Joshi was an excellent pilot with 43 air-to-air kills at this point, and those were both on the Western and Eastern Front and included Spitfires. He was also a highly experienced glider pilot, as all of the others in the squadron were. Now, one morning in 1943, he buckled himself into a 163A routine flight, and this one was a powered takeoff, which they referred to as a sharp start. The takeoff went well. The rocket engine was running perfectly, as evidenced by the diamond pattern in the exhaust. We'll talk about that later. And the plane lifted off the ground. Now, the 163 took off via a wheeled dolly. It didn't have conventional landing gear, and that dolly was dropped shortly after takeoff, which would, of course, reduce weight and drag. The plane would then later land on its retractable skid. Now, after liftoff, Joshi released the dolly, and it fell to the ground, but for some reason, perhaps it hit a bump on the field, maybe he released it a little bit too soon, I don't know, but it bounced back up, and it hit the 163 in such a way that it cut off the rocket engine instantly. It's been speculated that it hit the T-stoff feed line. Now, in an amazing display of airmanship, Joshi pulled the plane up using what little momentum he had and reached an altitude of about 100 meters. That's about 300 feet. That was enough, but not by much. Not enough to bail out, but he was able to bank the airplane enough and glide just well enough to get back to the field, which was his only option. And I've got to say, that's amazingly tricky to do. You wouldn't think so, but you've got to fly the plane perfectly at best glide speeds. The wind's got to be in your favor. Most flight instructors say never attempt returning to the airport after an engine failure on takeoff in a single-engine airplane. Most of the time, you won't make it. But it is possible. And in this case, it was his only option. However, there was a flak tower in his path, and he didn't see it. Probably because he looked back before starting his turn, and it was blocked from sight by the swept wing. From there, I'm assuming he was hyper-focused on airspeed to maintain best glide, so he would have a chance of returning successfully. That's my theory, of course. We don't know for sure why he didn't see that flak tower. I can think of other possibilities too, including chemicals leaking into the cockpit or who knows what. But as his plane came back to the field, his wing clipped that flak tower just barely, but in airplanes, just barely is a problem, and it was enough to cause disaster. The plane crashed, but it didn't explode, and that gave those on the ground that were watching hope that he might live with nothing but a few broken bones. Pilots and rescuers rushed across the field, but tragically they found that a T-stoff line had broken and dissolved Joshi. Thankfully, he had almost certainly been knocked unconscious first when his head hit the instrument panel. Joshi's death hit the squadron hard. He had been very popular, and of course Suzanne was devastated. Mano Ziegler commented that it was unusual for the squadron to be so affected by a death because at this point they'd been at war for almost 4 years, but this one was apparently quite traumatic for them. Now, this accident, and there were many others, okay, but this one, and the reason I'm talking about it is this one really describes just how dangerous this plane was and how brave somebody had to be to fly it. Once that engine cut out, and was a fairly likely thing to happen by aircraft standards, Joshi was in a dire situation, but through amazing skill, he almost made it. Probably would have had not been for that flak tower being exactly where it was. And even after hitting that, he got lucky in that the plane didn't explode, but of course fate stepped in with that broken T-stoff line. So let's get into the airframe. We'll go over the basics first. I want to start off with the wing, and there's actually a lot to talk about here, as it has some unique, for World War II, combinations of features. In fact, I think it has some unique features, period. Notice it's a swept wing. I could not find an official source stating the amount of sweep present. Normally, wing sweep is measured not from the leading edge, but from a line that's 25% of the way back from the leading edge. You compare that to a line that is perpendicular to the plane's longitudinal axis. Sources vary, but it appears to me that the 163 has about 22 degrees of sweepback. For comparison, the FA-18 has about 20 degrees, the Airbus A320 about 25 degrees. The Boeing 727, which I think is the best short and medium range airliner ever, has 32 degrees, and the F-15 comes in at about 45 degrees. So the 163 sweepback angle of 22 degrees is at the lower end of the scale compared with newer designs, but it's actually about the same or slightly more than an FA-18, so it's not insignificant. Now obviously there are pros and cons to sweepback, otherwise all planes would be flying around with seriously swept wings. So let's look at these factors as they apply to the Me-163. First of all, sweepback makes the flaps less effective. The normal method for solving this is to build a complex flap system that makes up for it. As an example, the 727 with its 32 degrees of sweepback uses triple slotted Fowler flaps on the trailing edge and a complex flap and slat system on the leading edge. Now, a lot of military airplanes maybe don't have such complicated flap systems with a lot of sweepback, but they have drag chutes and arrestor hooks, other things to help them land. Now, a complicated flap system was not an option for the 163 designers because the trailing edge was already taken up by the plane's unconventional control surfaces. The only type of flap system they could install were split flaps, and they had to locate them farther forward than normal, reducing their effectiveness at reducing landing speeds even further. And that's a problem because the 163 already has a very high landing speed, and this contributes to that, which increases the danger of it blowing up while landing. Now, Sweetback also tends to increase induced drag, although not too much at lower sweepback angles. That's not really a factor in this application because, as most viewers of this channel already know, induced drag is most prominent at low speeds and becomes relatively insignificant at high speeds. Since the 163 would normally be in combat at high speeds, this is just an insignificant drawback. Now, we're still focusing on the downsides. The next issue is that Sweetback will cause the tips of the wings to stall before the wing root. This tendency is even stronger when the Sweetback is combined with taper, as it is on the 163 and most other swept-wing airplanes. Now that's a problem for a number of reasons. First of all, it's much harder to notice the onset of the stall. When it happens at the wing root, you can physically feel the air buffeting, especially in a smaller airplane like a single-seat fighter. But when it's out at the tips, you probably won't notice it as easily. More concerning is the fact that when the stall happens at the tips first and works its way inboard, you lose your aileron effectiveness very quickly. In fact, in this situation, they may reverse on you because the down aileron will deepen the stall on that wing, causing a greater loss of lift. In other words, you're in the stall, the left wing starts to drop, you move the stick to the right, and that'll make the left wing start to drop even faster. So it's a big deal. Now, there are two ways a designer can rectify this. First, a fixed leading edge slot or movable slat can be located forward of the aileron. This is a common Messerschmitt feature. The 109s have a leading edge slat forward of the aileron largely for this reason. People think it's for turn performance. Not really. Now, the 163 had a fixed position slot, which is there to help prevent the outboard section from stalling first, thus preserving the effectiveness of the combined elevator and ailerons, which are called elevons. Now, another method designers use to solve this problem is wing twist. This is when the wing is constructed in such a way that it's twisted so the angle of attack is highest at the inboard section and lower in the outboard sections. I don't have a source for this in regards to the 163, thus I can't be 100% certain it has wing twist. But just looking at pictures of the airplane, I feel that I can see wing twist built in. Maybe you can too, just use your own judgment there. So it may be due to the slots or a combination of slots and wing twist, but the 163 does not seem to have had problems with tip stalling. I haven't read a single pilot report complaining about that, and that is something people complain about when it happens. So I think in that regard the design was very sound. There are, of course, some big advantages to Sweetback. Normally, the main benefit is that it reduces the onset of all compressibility effects, and I suppose that's the main benefit here too. This alone is a very complex topic. It would really need its own video, so for the sake of keeping this video moving along, I'm going to boil it down to one thing. Sweetback allows for a higher critical Mach number. In this case, the 163's maximum Mach number is 0.84. That's pretty high, higher than any U.S. World War II fighter, including the P-80. The 262 is a bit higher, a limit of 0.86, and so is the Spitfire, interestingly, although at lower altitudes the Spitfire dive speed was not competitive because indicated airspeed limitations came into play. Thus, no Allied plane could keep up with the 163 in a dive, and furthermore, and this may not be immediately obvious, but due to the Sweetback, the 163 is able to achieve this Mach number with a fairly thick and large wing. Those typically go against you in that. And that helps its maneuverability. Once it runs out of fuel, it can evade Allied fighters by maneuvering at very high speeds in a dive until it reaches either protective air cover or protective anti-aircraft fire. At least that was the plan. Now in actual practice, and we'll get into this a lot more later, but in actual practice, The first part of that plan worked pretty well, the diving and maneuvering to escape enemy fighters. The second half really didn't, and like I say, we'll get to that another time. Now, there are two more factors related to Sweetback on the 163, and they're important. First, it moves the elevons farther aft of the center of gravity. This matters because all three of the plane's axis, any airplane, vertical, lateral, and longitudinal, run through the center of gravity, or CG. Thus, if the elevons don't have enough distance from the CG, they won't have enough leverage, and thus will have minimal pitch authority. Sweetback moves them farther back relative to the CG. In the 163, they're still not that far back, though, so to help improve the situation, the 163 has trim flaps inboard of the elevons. These move together. They're not opposite like ailerons. And they move together to trim the plane's nose up or down. So, seeing all this, it's probably very clear to you now why the 163's landing flaps could not be located in the conventional location. That space simply had to be taken up by the trim flaps due to the lack of distance from the elevons to the center of gravity. Now, in all airplanes, the location of the center of gravity is pretty important. Pilots do calculations to make sure it's within limitations prior to takeoff. If it's too far forward, you might not be able to rotate and get the nose off the ground. If it's too far aft, you might not be able to recover from a stall, and there's a whole host of other problems. So, when pilots figure this out, they have to do the weight and balance and account for changes in center of gravity due to fuel burn. And in the case of the 163, the fuel tanks are located very near the CG. Thus, as it burns off fuel, and remember, it burns off its entire fuel load in about 8 minutes. When it does that, the CG doesn't move all that much. In the case of the 163A, the tank holding the, and this is a 163B picture here, but just go with it. In the case of the 163A, the tank holding the flesh-dissolving T-stoff is located right behind the pilot. The tanks holding the C-stoffs, or Z-stoff as the case may be, are in the wings. Now, I would have preferred it to be the other way around, but that wasn't possible because the T-stoff to C-stoff ratio had to be about 3 to 1. There's not enough room in the wings for that much T-stoff. Plus, bigger wing tanks would have the effect of causing a larger CG shift as fuel is burned. You can see that just by looking at it. Imagine a wing tank that goes all the way out to the tip. As you're burning the fuel, the center of gravity is going to move forward considerably. Now, the 163B has some additional fuel capacity. Hey, sounds great. More burn time for your rocket engine, right? Well, guess where they decided to put the additional tanks holding the flesh-dissolving T-stoff? If you answered in the cockpit, you are correct. The B model has 2 extra T-stoff tanks, one on either side of the pilot. So, yeah, that's just great. Now, there's one more factor we need to discuss that's related to Sweetback, and I have not seen this ever mentioned in relation to the 163, but I think it's important, especially because Lippisch himself talked about it. Notice that all of Lippisch's tailless design aircraft have Sweetback, even the early ones that had sub 100 mile per hour top speed. Obviously, he wasn't concerned about Mach number there. In fact, notice that all tailless designs have Sweetback. Everything from hang gliders to the B-2. Why is that? Well, it has to do with stability. If an aircraft enters a side slip, a normal aircraft, the air hitting the vertical stabilizer will cause it to weather vane back into the wind. This is one of the many design features of airplanes which enhances stability. The tail acts something like the feathers on an arrow to keep the plane pointed into the relative wind. So, how do we get this effect on a tailless airplane? Or in the case of a Lippisch design, a plane with vertical surfaces that are not far enough back to get the desired effect? The answer is to use Sweetback. Here's why this works. It's actually very simple. As the plane side slips, the wing that is moving into the wind has more drag, thus has the effect of yawing the plane, in the case of this diagram here, to the right. Notice that in the text associated with this image, it specifically mentions that this is of importance in tailless aircraft. That, of course, is from Aerodynamics for Naval Aviators. If you're a fan of this channel, you already knew that. Now, as Lippisch's early designs were tailless, I think it's safe to assume that he understood this concept. There seems to be a conception out there, I see this all the time on the internet, that the Germans, when it comes to Sweetback, didn't really know what they were doing, they just kind of lucked into this, and that's a bunch of nonsense. They knew exactly what they were doing. There are at least 10 NACA reports that Lippisch himself wrote. Remember, there was a lot of cooperation between aviation designers in the US and Germany, at least up until the late 1930s, and a lot of Lippisch's reports were translated into English and put into the NACA library, which is now the NASA library. And he mentions more than once the stability effects of Sweetback. Now, of course, the 163 does have a vertical stabilizer and a conventional rudder. However, the plane itself grew from previous Lippisch designs. And in any case, the Sweetback allows for a smaller tail, thus less drag, than would have been otherwise needed for stability. So it's a very important factor in the 163's design. So in summary, the 163 Sweetback increases the maximum Mach number, adds stability, moves the elevons back to give it more leverage, give them more leverage, and all of these are good things. The big drawback of the wing design was the inability to fit effective flaps and the resulting high landing speeds. Now that's a basic overview of Sweetback as it applies to the 163. If you want to dig deeper into this, because there's a lot more to Sweetback, if you want to get more into it, pick up a copy of Aerodynamics for Naval Aviators. It's a free government publication. Now, I think I'll end this video at this point. The rest of the plane and the rest of the story I will cover in part 2. Thanks for watching and have a great day. Just one more thing. We're here in Taipei, Taiwan, not to be confused with Thailand. I'm in the front room of my hotel suite at the wonderful Imperial. And this ties into the channel a little bit because this is where Vietnam War pilots on the American side went for R&R. So I'll show you a little bit of that. As we exit the room, I also want to point out, I have to travel and carry 17 days worth of stuff in 2 carry-on bags, one of which is entirely taken up by work stuff. So everything I use for these videos is right here. My laptop, in fact, the video that's on the screen is the one that you're watching now. I'm still making it. And an iPad and the phone I'm holding. And there's me. I'm looking good. So let's head out of the hotel room and check out the Imperial a little bit. This is one of my favorite places to stay in Taiwan. Actually, it is my favorite place in Taiwan. It's one of my favorite places to stay in the world, certainly in Asia. So we'll go over here to the lounge. This is where I have breakfast every day. And there's the wonderful Hannah. She gave me some information on the hotel. She's wearing a mask because the coronavirus is happening right now. It's a big deal here. Normally there's all the food set up here, and they make us breakfast, and they provide translation services, and make phone calls for us if we need them. Now, this street here is where all the recreational activity, well, not all of it, but if you Google Combat Zone Taiwan, that's what this is called, and it's called that because of all the, well, not combat-related activities, but activities that, let's say recreational activities that the pilots were engaged in. The area was populated by a lot of women with negotiable virtues. And today it's a pretty nice and developed area. You can see this nice apartment building here. So anyway, it's the Imperial, and it kind of ties into the Vietnam War, and we had a little bit about Vietnam War pilots in the last video, so I thought I would show you guys this. Anyhow, have a great day, everyone. Goodbye.